Hi, guys. So, today we will be doing a new topic called the digestive system anatomy. So, there will be several parts of this. So, the first part of today's video, we're going to look at the esophagus and the saliva glands. So, for example, we eat a pizza. We use our mastication. So, mastication is basically the process of using our teeth to physically break down the pizza into smaller pieces. Now, for the saliva glands, we actually have three saliva glands. And first is actually called the poronoid gland, the submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland. So what happens is that those saliva glands are actually going to release saliva itself. And the saliva inside contains the enzyme amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates like starch into glucose. Now, the amount of saliva we produce depends on the gland itself. For example, the submandibular gland produces about 70 to 75% of the saliva in our mouth, but for the other 15%, it would be produced by either the parotid gland or the sublingual gland. So, either one of those two would finish the remaining of the saliva. Now, when the saliva gland actually releases saliva, what happens is that they will act as a lubricant, lubricating the food, and they will form a ball around the food itself called a bolus itself. And what happens is that the enzymes inside they contain, amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates, like starch. So starch is actually called polysaccharides, and those polysaccharides will further break down into disaccharides, which is your sugar. However, if we were to eat protein wouldn't be physically not physically sorry I mean chemically digested inside the mouth is because there isn't any enzymes to break down proteins in the mouth, so we only can use mastication to physically break them down into smaller pieces, but we won't be able to chemically digest them. The only way we can chemically digest them is in the stomach itself. So to put for reference, right, the saliva gland on a daily average or under normal conditions, they produce about 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva every single day. So if you put it a reference, that's about 4.5 cans of Coke. Now, the reason why saliva is actually important is because it is actually needed to act as a lubricant for allowing us to actually swallow the food much more easily. It's needed for digestion, the breakdown, carbohydrates like starch into glucose, and needed for oral health as well, oral hygiene. Now, going on to the esophagus, where the esophagus, I've split this into three parts. So the first part, right, is actually the very top part. It is made out of skeletal muscle. So when, for example, skeletal muscles like your bicep, you're able to contract them. So you're able to move them and control them. So that's your voluntary movement. The second part will be the kind of like the mid part would be a mixture of smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. So you either can control it or cannot control it. So it's like a 50-50 between them. And the lowest part of the esophagus is made out of smooth muscle. So when we say smooth muscle, it means that it's involuntarily. So we cannot control this muscle. So that's why we actually use the movement called parasyletus. Parasyletus, it's basically the process of moving food towards the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, or the esophagus as well. Now, parasylesis, it's basically an involuntary wave of smooth muscle contraction that passes food through the either the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, or the large intestine. To put that into a more easier understanding, it's basically made out of smooth muscle. So you cannot control this movement. It naturally happens. It naturally happens in your small intestine, your large intestine, your stomach, and your esophagus as well. So all of these movements, parastasis, right? It's all involuntary, meaning you cannot control it. Now, talking about defecation. So defecation is, related to the anus, it's the control of the anus. So where the internal anal sphincter, which is involuntary movement, and the external anal sphincter, which is composed of skeletal muscles. So when we say internal and external anal sphincter, right, we're talking about the muscles around the anus itself. And for the internal anal sphincter, right, it's more of the inner portion of the muscle. So it's made out of smooth muscle. That's why it has involuntary movement, meaning you cannot control it. And for the external anal sphincter, right, it's basically composed of skeletal muscle. So you can control these movements. And these are important because it actually allows the voluntary control of bowel movement. Now, looking through the GI tract under a microscope, you can see that we have four different parts of the esophagus as well. So, first part we're going to look at is the mucosa, and then the second part we're going to look at the submucosa, the third part which will be the muscellus externa, and the last part the serosa. Now, the mucosa is actually a lining of the lumen itself, where it actually consists of epithelium. So you can see the inner portion of the esophagus has lined with the lumen itself, with lined with epithelium. And it also consists of lamina propria. So lamina propria, it's made out of loose connective tissue. So overall function for the mucosa is actually to help with protection, absorption, and secretion of nutrients. Now, further looking into the capillaries itself, so this is actually the lumen itself. So you can see the mucosa splits into the lamina propria and the epithelium. So the epithelium will be the most outer portion of it, and the lamina propria will be most inner surface of it. So those white matters. So if you see those red and blue systemic capillaries, those are actually going to absorb your carbohydrates and your amino acids. And for the lymphatic capillaries, which is the green one, they are going to absorb your fats or your lipids. Now, the submucosa, right, is actually the second part of the esophagus and is made out of dense connective tissue consisting of your large blood vessels, your lymphatics, and your nerves as well. So, all of these, right, they actually supply the mucosa itself, which is the previous one we talked about, including the capillaries in the lamina propria itself. Now, I want to add on this. This is actually called the muscarius mucosa. So think of this as like a fence, like a bridge, like a fence, separating the mucosa from the submucosa itself. And this is important because it actually allows the local movement of the mucosa to aid with secretion and absorption. And the muscarius mucosa, right, it's made out of smooth muscle, a thin layer of smooth muscle, so it just acts as a fence separating those two. And the muscarius externa, right, consists of the inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer, right? So when we say it has two layers, so first we're going to talk about the inner circular layer. So the inner circular layer, it's the one with let's say the inner circular layer, so the very inner part of the muscarius mucosa. And you can see the outer longitudinal layer, which would be the outer portion of the muscarius externa, right? So those, the including the internal circular layer and the outer circular layer, right? They're actually gonna help with the movement of peristalsis, all right, which helps the movement of food through the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. And they also have the process called segmentation, which mixes and breaks the bolus, the ball of saliva, into smaller pieces. So this is basically an example of peristalsis itself, like a toothpaste itself. When food is either traveling through the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, during peristalsis, right? What happens is that the inner circular layer we talked about, right, is actually going to contract, squeezing the bolus itself, or the circle, or kind of like the circle of the food itself. They're gonna squeeze the bolus itself. They're gonna squeeze the food, and while they are squeezing it, while the inner circular layer is actually squeezing it, the outer longitudinal layer will actually start to push that bolus forward to the GI tract. And think of the segmentation. So we're talking about segmentation. Think of this as like a ghost, the creepy ghost. It's basically it works together with the inner circular layer, helping to actually break the food down into smaller pieces, but without affecting the movement of the other longitudinal layer. So it doesn't really affect the movement of the bolus itself. It secretly helps out the inner circular layer. Now this is a oh sorry. So this is actually the last part. This is actually called the serosa. So the serosa is actually a visceroperitoneum, a serous membrane that covers the outer layer of the GI tract. And what happens is that this is important is because it actually secretes a thin layer of cirrhosis membrane, not cirrhosis membrane, cirrhosis fluid, which acts as a lubricant, and it lubricates or reduces the friction between the abdomen organs during movement itself. So think of this as just like the layer itself, or the serosa layer that has the serous membrane, and it basically secretes or release cirrhosis fluid to lubricate or reduce friction. Now you can see on a stain sheet of the esophagus itself, you actually can see the mucosa itself, and you can see the mucosa splits into the epithelium and the lamina propria. So the epithelium will be the outer portion of the mucosa, and you can see a lamina propria, which consists of the capillaries itself. Now I can see the muscarius mucosa, which is the fence, like I said, which separates the submucosa from the mucosa itself. And always remember that the submucosa is the only part of the esophagus that has dense connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. And the outer portion of the submucosa will have the muscarius externa, which has the internal circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer. And then the most external part of the esophagus would be the serosa, which consists of a serous membrane, which covers the outer surface of the GI tract, acting as a lubricant, reducing friction in between them. And then, my friends, is the esophagus and the salivary glands. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Go ahead and check out my other videos. Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. Not sorry, Part 2 and Part 3 will be coming out quite soon. So, thank you so much for watching. Peace.